Mary. There was in those days, I hope it is there still, a village called Ufferley, lying all among the hills and downs of North Hampshire. In every cottage garden there was a giant apple tree, and when these trees were hung red with fruit, and the newly lifted potatoes lay gleaming between bean row and cabbage patch, a young man walked into the village who had never been there before. He stopped in the lane just under Mrs. Hedges' gate and looked up into her garden. Rosie, who was picking the beans, heard his tentative cough and turned and leaned over the hedge to hear what he wanted. "I was wondering," said he, "if there was anybody in the village who had a lodging to let." He looked at Rosie, whose cheeks were redder than the apples, and whose hair was the softest yellow imaginable. "I was wondering," said he in amendment, "if you had." Rosie looked back at him. He wore a blue jersey, such as seafaring men wear, but he seemed hardly like a seafaring man. His face was brown and plain and pleasant, and his hair was black. He was shabby and he was shy, but there was something about him that made it very certain he was not just a tramp. "I'll ask," said Rosie. With that she ran for her mother, and Mrs. Hedges came out to interview the young man. "I've got to be near Andover for a week," said he, "but somehow I didn't fancy staying right in the town." "There's a bed," said Mrs. Hedges, "if you don't mind having your meals with us." "Why, surely, ma'am," said he. "There's nothing I'd like better." Everything was speedily arranged. Rosie picked another handful of beans, and in an hour he was seated with them at supper. He told them his name was Fred Baker, but apart from that he was so polite that he could hardly speak, and in the end Mrs. Hedges had to ask him outright what his business was. "Why, ma'am," said he, looking her straight in the face, "I've done one thing and another ever since I was so high. But I heard an old proverb once, how to get on in the world. Feed 'em or amuse 'em, it said. So that's what I do, ma'am. I travel with a pig." Mrs. Hedges said she'd never heard of such a thing. "You surprise me," said he. "Why, there are some in London, they tell me, making fortunes on the halls. Spell, count, add up, answer questions, anything. But let them wait," said he, smiling, "till they see Mary." "Is that the name of your pig?" asked Rosie. "Well," said Fred shyly, "it's what I call her just between ourselves like. To her public, she's Zola, sort of Frenchified, I thought. Spicy, if you'll excuse the mention of it. But in the caravan, I call her Mary." "You live in a caravan?" cried Rosie, delighted by the doll's house idea. "We do," said he. "She has her bunk, and I have mine." "I don't think I should like that," said Mrs. Hedges. "Not a pig, no." "She's as clean," said he, "as a newborn babe. And as for company, well, you'd say she's human. All the same, it's a bit of a wandering life for her, uphill and down dale, as the saying goes. Between you and me, I shan't be satisfied till I get her into one of these big London theatres. You can see us in the West End." "I should like the caravan best," said Rosie, who seemed to have a great deal to say for herself all of a sudden. "It's pretty," said Fred. "Curtains, you know, pot of flowers, little stove. Somehow I'm used to it. Can't hardly think of myself staying at one of them big hotels. Still, Mary's got her career to think of. I can't stand in the way of her talent, so that's that." "Is she big?" asked Rosie. "It's not her size," said he. "No more than Shirley Temple. It's her brains and personality. Clever as a wagon load of monkeys. You'd like her. She'd like you, I reckon. Yes, I reckon she would. Sometimes I'm afraid I'm a bit slow by way of company for her, never having had much to do with the ladies." "Don't tell me," said Mrs. Hedges archly, as convention required. "'Tis so, ma'am," said he. "Always on the move, you see, ever since I was a nipper. Baskets and brooms, pots and pans, then some acrobat stuff, then Mary. Never 2 days in the same place. It don't give you the time to get acquainted." "You're going to be here a whole week, though," said Rosie artlessly. But at once her red cheeks blushed 100 times redder than before, for Mrs. Hedges gave her a sharp look, which made her see that her words might have been taken the wrong way. Fred, however, noticed nothing. "Yes," said he, "I shall be here a week. And why? Mary ran a nail in her foot in the marketplace, Andover. Finished her act and collapsed. Now she's at the vet's, poor creature." "Oh, poor thing," cried Rosie. "I was half afraid," said he, "it was going wrong on her. but it seems she'll pull round all right, so I took opportunity to have the van repaired a bit, and soon we'll be on the road again. I shall go in and see her tomorrow. Maybe I can find some blackberries to take her by way of a relish, so to speak. Gauseley Bottom, said Rosie. That's the place where they grow big and juicy. Ah, if I knew where it was, said Fred tentatively. Perhaps in the morning, if she's got time, she'll show you, said Mrs. Hedges, who had begun to feel very kindly disposed toward the young man. In the morning, surely enough, Rosie did have time, and she showed Fred the place and helped him pick the berries. Returning from Andover later in the day, Fred reported that Mary had tucked into them a fair treat, and he had little doubt that if she could have spoken, she would have sent her special thanks. Nothing is more affecting than the gratitude of a dumb animal, and Rosie was impelled to go every morning with Fred to pick a few more berries for the invalid pig. On these excursions, Fred told her a great deal more about Mary, a bit about the caravan, and a little about himself. She saw that he was very bold and knowing in some ways, but incredibly simple and shy in others. This, she felt, showed he had a good heart. The end of the week seemed to come very soon, and all at once they were coming back from Gauseley Bottom for the last time. Fred said he would never forget Uffeley, nor the nice time he had had there. You ought to send us a postcard when you're on your travels, said Rosie. Yes, said he, that's an idea. I will. Yes, do, said Rosie. Yes, said he again, I will. Do you know, I was altogether downhearted at going away, but now I'm half wishing I was on the road again already. So I could be sending that card right away, said he. At that rate, said Rosie, looking the other way, you might as well make it a letter. Ah, said he, and do you know what I should feel like putting at the bottom of that letter? If you was my young lady, that is. Which, of course, you're not, me never having had one. What, said Rosie. A young lady, said he. But what would you put, said she. Ah, said he, what I'd put. Do you know what I'd put? If, mind you, you was my young lady. No, said she, what? I don't hardly like to tell you, said he. Go on, she said, you don't want to be afraid. All right, said he, only mind you it's if. And with his stick, he traced 3 crosses in the dust. If I was anybody's young lady, said Rosie, I shouldn't see anything wrong in that. After all, you've got to move with the times. Neither of them said another word, for 2 of the best reasons in the world. First, they were unable to. Second, it was not necessary. They walked on with their faces as red as fire, in an agony of happiness. Fred had a word with Mrs. Hedges, who had taken a fancy to him from the start. Not that she had not always looked down upon caravan people, and could have been knocked over with a feather had anyone suggested at any earlier date that she would allow a daughter of hers to marry into such company. But right was right. This Fred Baker was different, as anyone with half an eye could see. He had kept himself to himself almost to a fault, for his conversation showed that he was as innocent as a newborn babe. Moreover, several knowledgeable people in the village had agreed that his ambitions for Mary, his pig, were in no way unjustified. Everyone had heard of such talented creatures reclining on snow-white sheets in the best hotels of the metropolis, drinking champagne like milk, and earning for their fortunate owners £10 or even £20 a week. So Mrs. Hedges smilingly gave her consent, and Rosie became Fred's real, genuine, proper young lady. He was to save all he could during the winter, and she to stitch and sing. In the spring, he would come back, and they would get married. At Easter, said he. No, said Mrs. Hedges, counting on her fingers. In May. Then tongues can't wag, caravan or no caravan. Fred had not the faintest idea what she was driving at, for he had lived so much alone that no one had told him certain things that every young man should know. However, he well realized that this was an unusually short engagement for Uffeley, and represented a great concession to the speed and dash of the entertainment industry, so he respectfully agreed and set off on his travels. My darling Rosie, well, here we are in Painswick, having had a good night Saturday at Evesham. Mary cleverer than ever, that goes without saying. Now spells 4 new words, 36 in all. And when I say, now, Mary, how do you like Painswick or Evesham or wherever it is, she picks F-I-N-E. It goes down very well. She is in the best of health, and I hope you are the same. Seems to understand every word I say, more like a human being every day. Well, I suppose I must be getting our bit of supper ready. She always sets up her cry for that, especially when I am writing to you. With true love, Fred. Cross, cross, cross. In May, the apple trees were all in bloom, so it was an apple blossom wedding, which in those parts is held to be an assurance of flowery days. Afterwards, they took the bus to the market town to pick up the caravan which stood in a stable yard. On the way, Fred asked Rosie to wait a moment and dived into a confectioner's shop. He came out with a huge box of chocolates. Rosie smiled all over her face with joy. "For me?" she said. "Yes," said he, "to give to her as soon as she claps eyes on you. They're her weakness. I want you two to be real pals." "All right," said Rosie, who was the best-hearted girl in the world. The next moment they turned into the yard. There was the caravan. "Oh, it's lovely," cried Rosie. "Now you'll see her," said Fred. At the sound of his voice, a falsetto squeal rose from within. "Here we are, old lady," said Fred, opening the door. "Here's a friend of mine, come to help to look after you. Look, she's brought you something you'll fancy." Rosie saw a middle-sized pig, flesh-colored, neat, and with a smart collar. It had a small and rather calculating eye. Rosie offered the chocolates. They were accepted without any very effusive acknowledgement. Fred put the old horse in, and soon they were off, jogging up the long hills to the west. Rosie sat beside Fred on the driving seat. Mary took her afternoon nap. Soon the sky began to redden where the road divided the woods on the far hilltop. Fred turned into a green lane, and they made their camp. He lit the stove, and Rosie put on the potatoes. They took a lot of peeling, for it seemed that Mary ate with gusto. Rosie put a gigantic rice pudding into the oven, and soon had the rest of the meal prepared. Fred set the table. He laid 3 places. "I say," said Rosie. "What?" said Fred. "Does she eat along with us?" said Rosie. "A pig?" Fred turned quite pale. He beckoned her outside the caravan. "Don't say a thing like that," said he. "She won't never take to you if you say a thing like that. Didn't you see her give you a look?" "Yes, I did," said Rosie. "All the same. Well, never mind, Fred. I don't care, really. I just thought I did." "You wait," said Fred. "You're thinking of ordinary pigs. Mary's different." Certainly Mary seemed a comparatively tidy eater. All the same, she gave Rosie 1 or 2 very odd glances from under her silky, straw-coloured lashes. She seemed to hock her rice pudding about a bit with the end of her nose. "What's up, old girl?" said Fred. "Didn't you put enough sugar in the pudding?" "Never mind. Can't get everything right first time." Mary, with rather a cross hiccup, settled herself on her bunk. "Let's go out," said Rosie, "and have a look at the moon." "I suppose we might," said Fred. "Shan't be long, Mary. Just going about as far as that gate down the lane." Mary grunted morosely and turned her face to the wall. Rosie and Fred went out and leaned over the gate. The moon, at least, was all that it should be. "Seems funny, being married and all," said Rosie softly. "Seems all right to me," said Fred. "Remember them crosses you drew in the dirt on the road that day?" said Rosie. "That I do," said Fred. "And all them you put in the letters?" said Rosie. "All of 'em," said Fred. "I remember every one." "Kisses, that's what they're supposed to stand for," said Rosie. "So they say," said Fred. "You haven't given me one, not since we was married," said Rosie. "Don't you like it?" "That I do," said Fred. "Only, I don't know." "What?" said Rosie. "It makes me feel all queer," said Fred, "when I kiss you. As if I wanted—" "What?" said Rosie. "I don't know," said Fred. "I don't know if it's I want to eat you all up or what." "Try and find out, they say," said Rosie. A delicious moment followed. In the very middle of it, a piercing squeal rose from the caravan. Fred jumped as if he was shot. "Oh, dear," he cried. "She's wondering what's up. Here I come, old girl, here I come. It's her bedtime, you see. Here I come to tuck you in." Mary, with an air of some petulance, permitted this process. Rosie stood by. "I suppose we'd better make it lights out," said Fred. "She likes a lot of sleep, you see, being a brain worker." "Where do we sleep?" said Rosie. "I made the bunk all nice for you this morning," said Fred. "Me, I'm going to doss below. A sack full of straw I've got." "But," said Rosie, "but what?" said he. "Nothing," she said. "Nothing." They turned in. Rosie lay for an hour or two, thinking what thoughts I don't know. Perhaps she thought how charming it was that Fred should have lived so simple and shy and secluded all these years, and yet be so knowing about many things, and yet be so innocent and never have mixed up in bad company. It's impossible to say what she thought. In the end, she dozed off, only to be wakened by a sound like the bagpipes of the devil himself. She sat up, terrified. It was Mary. "What's up? What's up?" Fred's voice came like the ghosts in Hamlet from under the floor. "Give her some milk," he said. Rosie poured out a bowl of milk. Mary ceased her fiendish racket while she drank, but the moment Rosie had blown out the light and got into bed again, she began 100 times worse than before. There were rumblings under the caravan. Fred appeared in the doorway, half-dressed and with a straw in his hair. "She will have me," he said in great distress. Can't you lie down here?" said Rosie. "What? And you sleep below?" said Fred, astounded. "Yes," said Rosie, after a rather long pause, "and me sleep below." Fred was overwhelmed with gratitude and remorse. Rosie couldn't help feeling sorry for him. She even managed to give him a smile before she went down to get what rest she could on the sack of straw. In the morning she woke feeling rather dejected. There was a mighty breakfast to be prepared for Mary. Afterwards Fred drew her aside. "Look here," he said, "this won't do. I can't have you sleeping on the ground, worse than a jippo. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to get up my acrobat stuff again. I used to make a lot that way, and I like it fine. Handsprings, double somersaults, bit of conjuring. It went down well. Only I didn't have time to keep in practice with Mary to look after. But if you'd do the looking after her, we'd make it a double turn, and soon we'd have a good bit of cash. And then?" "Yes," said Rosie. "Then," said Fred, "I could buy you a trailer." "All right," said Rosie, and turned away. Suddenly she looked back with her face flaming. "You may know a lot about pigs," she said bitterly, "and about somersaults and conjuring and baskets and brooms and I don't know what all, but there's one thing you don't know." And with that she went off and cried behind a hedge. After a while she got the upper hand of it and came back to the caravan. Fred showed her how to give Mary her morning bath, then the depilatory, that was very hard on the hands, then the rubbing with Cleopatra face cream, and not on her face merely, then the powdering, then the manicuring and polishing of her trotters. Rosie, resolved to make the best of it, conquered her repugnance and soon mastered these handmaidenly duties. She was relieved at first that the spoiled pig accepted her ministrations without protest. Then she noticed the gloating look in its eye. However, there was no time to brood about that. No sooner was the toilet finished than it was time to prepare the enormous lunch. After lunch, Mary had her little walk, except on Saturdays when there was an afternoon show. And after the walk, she took her rest. Fred explained that during this period she liked to be talked to and to have her back scratched a bit. Mary had quite clearly decided that in the future she was going to have it scratched a lot. Then she had her massage. Then tea, then another little walk, or the evening show, according to where they were, and then it was time to prepare dinner. At the end of the day, Rosie was thankful to curl up on her poor sack of straw. When she thought of the bunk above, and Fred, and his simplicity, her heart was fit to break. The only thing was, she loved him dearly, and she felt that if they could soon snatch an hour alone together, they might kiss a little more, and a ray of light might dispel the darkness of excessive innocence. Each new day she watched for that hour, but it didn't come. Mary saw to that. Once or twice Rosie suggested a little stroll, but at once the hateful pig grumbled some demand or other that kept her hard at work till it was too late. Fred, on his side, was busy enough with his practicing. He meant it so well, and he worked so hard, but what did it lead to? A trailer. As the days went by, she found herself more and more the slave of this arrogant grunter. Her back ached, her hands got chapped and red, she never had a moment to make herself look nice, and never for a moment was she alone with her beloved. Her dress was spotted and spoiled, her smile was gone, her temper was going. Her pretty hair fell in elf locks and tangles, and she had neither time nor heart to comb it. She tried to come to an explanation with Fred, but it was nothing but cross purposes and then cross words. He tried in a score of little ways to show that he loved her, but these seemed to her a mere mockery, and she gave him short answers. Then he stopped, and she thought he loved her no longer. Even worse, she felt she no longer loved him. So the whole summer went by, and things got worse and worse, and you would have taken her for a gypsy indeed. The blackberries were ripe again. She had found a whole brake of them. When she tasted one, all sorts of memories flooded into her heart. She went and found Fred. "Fred," she said, "the blackberries are ripe again. I've brought you one or two." She held out some in her grubby hand. Fred took them and tasted them. She watched to see what the result would be. "Yes," said he, "they're ripe. They won't gripe her. Take her and pick her some this afternoon." Rosie turned away without a word, and in the afternoon she took Mary across the stubbles to where the ripe berries grew. Mary, when she saw them, dispensed for once with dainty service and began to help herself very liberally. Rosie, finding she had nothing more urgent to attend to, sat down on a bank and sobbed bitterly. In the middle of it all, she heard a voice asking what was the matter. She looked up, and there was a fat, shrewd, jolly-looking farmer. "What is it, Miguel?" said he. "Are you hungry?" "No," said she. "I'm fed up." "What with?" said he. "Pigs," said she with a gulp. "You've got no call to bawl and cry," said he. "There's nothing like a bit of pork. I'd have the indigestion for that any day." "It's not pork," said she. "It's a pig, a live pig." "Have you lost it?" said he. "I wish I had," said she. "I'm that miserable I don't know what to do." "Tell me your troubles," said he. "There's no harm in a bit of sympathy." So Rosie told him about Fred and about Mary, and what hopes she'd had and what they'd all come to, and how she was the slave of this insolent, spoiled, jealous pig. And in fact she told him everything except one little matter, which she could hardly bring herself to repeat, even to the most sympathetic of fat farmers. The farmer, pushing his hat over his eyes, scratched his head very thoughtfully. "Really," said he, "I can't hardly believe it." "It's true," said Rosie, "every word." "I mean," said the farmer, "a young man, a young gal sleeping down on a sack of straw, a pretty young gal like you, properly married and all. Not to put too fine a point on it, young missus, aren't the bunks wide enough, or what?" "He doesn't know," sobbed Rosie. "He doesn't know no more than a baby, and she won't ever let us be alone for a minute, so he never gets a chance to find out." The farmer scratched his head more furiously than ever. Looking at her tear-stained face, he found it hard to doubt her. On the other hand, it seemed impossible that a pig should know so much and a young man should know so little. But at that moment, Mary came trotting through the bushes with an egotistical look on her face, which was well besmeared with the juice of the ripe berries. "Is this your pig?" said the farmer. "Well," said Rosie, "I'm just taking her for a walk." The shrewd farmer was quick to notice the look that Rosie got from the haughty grunter when it heard the expression, "your pig." This, and Rosie's hurried, nervous disclaimer, convinced the worthy man that the story he had heard was well-founded. "You're taking her for a walk," said he musingly. "Well, well, well. I'll tell you what. If you'd have been here this time tomorrow, you'd have met me taking a walk with a number of very dear young friends of mine, all very much like her. She might have come along. 2 young sows, beautiful creatures, though maybe not so beautiful as that one. 3 young boars, in the prime of their health and handsomeness. Though I say as shouldn't, him that's unattached, he's a prince. Oh, what a beautiful young boar that young boar really is." "You don't say," said Rosie. "For looks and pedigree both," said the farmer, "he's a prince. The fact is, it's their birthday, and I'm taking them over to the village for a little bit of a celebration. I suppose this young lady has some other engagement tomorrow." "She has to have her sleep just about this time," said Rosie, ignoring Mary's angry grunt. "Pity," said the farmer. "She'd have just made up the party. Such fun they'll have. Such refreshments, sweet apples, cakes, biscuits, a whole bucketful of ice cream. Everything most refined, of course, but plenty. You know what I mean, plenty. And that young boar, you know what I mean, if she should be walking by." "I'm afraid not," said Rosie. "Pity," said the farmer. "Oh, well, I must be moving along." With that he bade them good afternoon, raising his hat very politely to Mary, who looked after him for a long time and then walked sulkily home, gobbling to herself all the way. The next afternoon, Mary seemed eager to stretch out on her bunk, and for once, instead of requiring the usual number of little attentions from Rosie, she closed her eyes in sleep. Rosie took the opportunity to pick up a pail and go off to buy the evening ration of fresh milk. When she got back, Fred was still at his practice by the wayside, and Rosie went round to the back of the caravan, and the door was swinging open, and the bunk was empty. She called Fred. They sought high and low. They went along the roads, fearing she might have been knocked over by a motor car. They went calling through the woods, hoping she had fallen asleep under a tree. They looked in ponds and ditches, behind haystacks, under bridges, everywhere. Rosie thought of the farmer's joking talk, but she hardly liked to say anything about it to Fred. They called and called all night, scarcely stopping to rest. They sought all the next day. It grew dark, and Fred gave up hope. They plodded silently back to the caravan. He sat on a bunk with his head in his hand. "I shall never see her again," he said. "Been pinched, that's what she's been. When I think," he said, "of all the hopes I had for that pig. When I think," he said, "of all you've done for her and what it's meant to you. I know she had some faults in her nature," he said, "but that was artistic. Temperament it was, when you've got a talent like that. And now she's gone," he said, and with that he burst into tears. "Oh, Fred," cried Rosie, "don't." Suddenly she found she loved him just as much as ever, more than ever. She sat down beside him and put her arms around his neck. "Darling Fred, don't cry," she said again. "It's been rough on you, I know," said Fred. "I didn't ever mean it to be." "There, there," said Rosie. She gave him a kiss. Then she gave him another. It was a long time since they had been as close as this. There was nothing but the two of them and the caravan, the tiny lamp, and darkness all around. Their kisses and grief all around. "Don't let go," said Fred. "It makes it better." "I'm not letting go," she said. "Rosie," said Fred, "I feel... Do you know how I feel?" "I know," she said. "Don't talk." "Rosie," said Fred, but this was some time later. "Who'd have thought it?" "Ah, who would indeed," said Rosie. "Why didn't you tell me?" said Fred. "How could I tell you?" said she. "You know," said he, "we might never have found out, never, if she hadn't been pinched." "Don't talk about her," said Rosie. "I can't help it," said Fred. "Wicked or not, I can't help it. I'm glad she's gone. It's worth it. I'll make enough on the acrobat stuff. I'll make brooms as well, pots and pans, too." "Yes," said Rosie, "but look, it's morning already. I reckon you're tired, Fred, running uphill and down dale all day yesterday. You lie abed now, and I'll go down to the village and get you something good for breakfast." "All right," said Fred, "and tomorrow I'll get yours." So Rosie went down to the village and bought the milk and the bread and so forth. As she passed the butcher's shop, she saw some newly made pork sausages of a singularly fresh, plump, and appetizing appearance. So she bought some, and very good they smelled while they were cooking. "That's another thing we couldn't have while she was here," said Fred, as he finished his plateful. "Never no pork sausages on account of her feelings. I never thought to see the day I'd be glad she was pinched. I only hope she's gone to someone who appreciates her." "I'm sure she has," said Rosie. "Have some more." "I will," said he. "I don't know if it's the novelty, or the way you cooked 'em, or what. I never ate a better sausage in my life. If we'd gone up to London with her, best hotels and all, I doubt if ever we'd have had as sweet a sausage as these here." Dr. Rankin was a large and raw-boned man on whom the newest suit at once appeared outdated, like a suit in a photograph of 20 years ago. This was due to the squareness and flatness of his torso, which might have been put together by a manufacturer of packing cases. His face also had a wooden and a roughly constructed look. His hair was wig-like and resentful of the comb. He had those huge and clumsy hands which can be an asset to a doctor in a small upstate town where people still retain a rural relish for paradox, thinking that the more ape-like the paw, the more precise it can be in the delicate business of a tonsillectomy. This conclusion was perfectly justified in the case of Dr. Rankin. For example, on this particular fine morning, though his task was nothing more ticklish than the cementing over of a large patch on his cellar floor, he managed those huge and clumsy hands with all the unflurried certainty of one who would never leave a sponge within or create an unsightly scar without. The doctor surveyed his handiwork from all angles. He added a touch here and a touch there till he had achieved a smoothness altogether professional. He swept up a few last crumbs of soil and dropped them into the furnace.
He paused before putting away the pick and shovel he had been using, and found occasion for yet another artistic sweep of his trowel, which made the new surface precisely flush with the surrounding floor. At this moment of supreme concentration, the porch door upstairs slammed with the report of a minor piece of artillery, which, appropriately enough, caused Dr. Rankin to jump as if he had been shot. The doctor lifted a frowning face and an attentive ear. He heard two pairs of heavy feet clump across the resonant floor of the porch. He heard the house door opened and the visitors enter the hall, with which his cellar communicated by a short flight of steps. He heard whistling, and then the voices of Buck and Bud, crying, "Doc! Hi, Doc! They're biting." Whether the doctor was not inclined for fishing that day, or whether, like others of his large and heavy type, he experienced an especially sharp and sociable reaction on being suddenly startled, or whether he was merely anxious to finish undisturbed the job in hand and proceed to more important duties, he did not respond immediately to the inviting outcry of his friends. Instead, he listened while it ran its natural course, dying down at last into a puzzled and fretful dialogue. "I guess he's out. I'll write a note. Say we're at the creek. Come on down." We could tell Irene. "But she's not here either. You'd think she'd be around." "Ought to be by the look of the place." "You said it, Bud. Just look at this table. You could write your name." "Shh. Look." Evidently the last speaker had noticed that the cellar door was ajar and that a light was shining below. Next moment the door was pushed wide open and Bud and Buck looked down. "Why, Doc, there you are. Didn't you hear us yelling?" The doctor, not too pleased at what he had overheard, nevertheless smiled his rather wooden smile as his two friends made their way down the steps. "I thought I heard someone," he said. "We were bawling our heads off," Buck said. "Thought nobody was home. Where's Irene?" "Visiting," said the doctor. "She's gone visiting." "Hey, what goes on?" said Bud. "What are you doing? Burying one of your patients or what?" "Oh, there's been water seeping up through the floor," said the doctor. "I figured it might be some spring opened up or something." "You don't say," said Bud, assuming instantly the high ethical standpoint of the realtor. "Gee, Doc, I sold you this property. Don't say I fixed you up with a dump where there's an underground spring." "There was water," said the doctor. "Yes, but Doc, you can look on that geological map the Kiwanis Club got up. There's not a better section of subsoil in the town." "Looks like he sold you a pup," said Buck, grinning. "No," said Bud, "look. When the doc came here, he was green. You'll admit he was green. The things he didn't know." "He bought Ted Weber's jalopy," said Buck. "He'd have bought the Jessup place if I'd let him," said Bud. "But I wouldn't give him a bum steer." "Not the poor, simple city slicker from Poughkeepsie," said Buck. "Some people would have taken him," said Bud. "Maybe some people did. Not me. I recommended this property. He and Irene moved straight in as soon as they were married. I wouldn't have put the doc onto a dump where there'd be a spring under the foundations." "Oh, forget it," said the doctor, embarrassed by this conscientiousness. "I guess it was just the heavy rains." "By gosh," Buck said, glancing at the bespeared point of the pickaxe, "you certainly went deep enough. Right down into the clay, huh?" "That's 4 feet down, the clay," Bud said. 18 inches, said the doctor. 4 feet, said Bud. "I can show you on the map." "Come on, no arguments," said Buck. "How's about it, Doc? An hour or two at the creek, eh? They're biting." "Can't do it, boys," said the doctor. "I've got to see a patient or two." "Oh, live and let live, Doc," Bud said. "Give them a chance to get better. You going to depopulate the whole darn town?" The doctor looked down, smiled, and muttered, as he always did when this particular jest was trotted out. "Sorry, boys," he said, "I can't make it." "Well," said Bud, disappointed, "I suppose we better get along. How's Irene?" "Irene," said the doctor, "never better. She's gone visiting. Albany. Got the 11 o'clock train." 11 o'clock, said Buck, "for Albany." "Did I say Albany?" said the doctor. "Watertown, I meant." "Friends in Watertown?" Buck asked. "Mrs. Slater," said the doctor. "Mr. and Mrs. Slater. Lived next door to him when she was a kid, Irene said, over on Sycamore Street." "Slater," said Bud, "next door to Irene? Not in this town." "Oh, yes," said the doctor. "She was telling me all about them last night. She got a letter. Seems as Mrs. Slater looked after her when her mother was in the hospital one time." "No," said Bud. "That's what she told me," said the doctor. "Of course, it was a good many years ago." "Look, Doc," said Buck, "Bud and I were raised in this town. We've known Irene's folks all our lives. We were in and out of their house all the time. There was never anybody next door called Slater. Perhaps, said the doctor, she married again, this woman. Perhaps it was a different name. Bud shook his head. What time did Irene go to the station? Buck asked. Oh, about a quarter of an hour ago, said the doctor. You didn't drive her, said Buck. She walked, said the doctor. We came down Main Street, Buck said. We didn't meet her. Maybe she walked across the pasture, said the doctor. That's a tough walk with a suitcase, said Buck. She just had a couple of things in a little bag, said the doctor. Bud was still shaking his head. Buck looked at Bud, and then at the pig, at the new damp cement on the floor. Oh, God, Doc, Bud said, a guy like you. What in the name of heaven are you two bloody fools thinking? Asked the doctor. What are you trying to say? A spring, said Bud. I ought to have known right away it wasn't any spring. The doctor looked at his cement work, at the pig, at the large, worried faces of his two friends. His own face turned livid. Am I crazy, he said, or are you? You suggest that Irene, my wife... Oh, go on, get out. Yes, go and get the sheriff. Tell him to come here and start digging. You get out. Bud and Buck looked at each other, shifted their feet, and stood still again. Go on, said the doctor. I don't know, said Bud. It's not as if he didn't have the provocation, Buck said. God knows, Buck said. You know, I know, the whole town knows. But try telling it to a jury. The doctor put his hand to his head. What's that, he said? What is it? Now what are you saying? What do you mean? If this ain't being on the spot, said Buck. Doc, you can see how it is. It takes some thinking. We've been friends right from the start. Darn good friends. But we've got to think, said Bud. It's serious. Provocation or not, there's a law in the land. There's such a thing as being an accomplice. You were talking about provocation, said the doctor. You're right, said Buck, and you're our friend, and if ever it could be called justified... We've got to fix this somehow, said Bud. Justified, said the doctor. You were bound to get wised up sooner or later, said Buck. We could have told you, said Bud, only what the hell. We could, said Buck, and we nearly did. 5 years ago, before ever you married her. You hadn't been here 6 months, but we sort of cottoned to you. Thought of giving you a hint. Spoke about it. Remember, Bud? Bud nodded. Funny, he said. I came right out in the open about that Jessup property. I wouldn't let you buy that, Doc. But getting married, that's something else again. We could have told you. We are that much responsible, Buck said. I'm 50, said the doctor. I suppose it's pretty old for Irene. If you was Johnny Weissmuller at the age of 21, it wouldn't make any difference, said Buck. I know a lot of people think she's not exactly a perfect wife, said the doctor. Maybe she's not. She's young. She's full of life. Oh, skip it, said Buck sharply, looking at the raw cement. Skip it, Doc, for God's sake. The doctor brushed his hand across his face. Not everybody wants the same thing, he said. I'm a sort of dry fellow. I don't open up very easily. Irene, you'd call her gay. You said it, said Buck. She's no housekeeper, said the doctor. I know that. That's not the only thing a man wants. She enjoys herself. Yeah, said Buck, she did. That's what I love, said the doctor, because I'm not that way myself. She's not very deep mentally, all right. Say she's stupid, I don't care. Lazy, no system, well, I've got plenty of system. She's enjoyed herself. It's beautiful, it's innocent, like a child. Yes, if that was all, Buck said. But, said the doctor, turning his eyes full on him, you seem to know there was more. Everybody knows it, said Buck. A decent, straightforward guy comes to a place like this and marries the town floozy, Bud said bitterly, and nobody'll tell him. Everybody just watches. And laughs, said Buck. You and me, Bud, as well as the rest. We told her to watch her steps, said Bud. We warned her. Everybody warned her, said Buck, but people get fed up. When it got to truck drivers... It was never us, Doc, said Bud earnestly. Not after you came along, anyway. The town will be on your side, said Buck. That won't mean much when the case comes to trial in the county seat, said Bud. Oh, cried the doctor suddenly, what shall I do? What shall I do? It's up to you, Bud, said Buck. I can't turn him in. Take it easy, Doc, said Bud. Calm down. Look, Buck, when we came in here, the street was empty, wasn't it? I guess so, said Buck. Anyway, nobody saw us come down cellar. And we haven't been down, Bud Bard said, addressing himself forcefully to the doctor. Get that, Doc? We shouted upstairs, hung around a minute or two and cleared out, but we never came down into this cellar. I wish you hadn't, the doctor said heavily. All you have to do is say Irene went out for a walk and never came back, said Buck. Bud and I can swear we saw her headed out of town with a fellow in, well, say in a Buick sedan. Everybody will believe that, all right. We'll fix it, but later. Now we better scram. And remember now, stick to it. We never came down here and we haven't seen you today, said Bud. So long. Buck and Bud ascended the steps, moving with a rather absurd degree of caution. You'd better get that thing covered up, Buck said over his shoulder. Left alone, the doctor sat down on an empty box, holding his head with both hands. He was still sitting like this when the porch door slammed again. This time he did not start. He listened. The house door opened and closed. A voice cried, "Yoo-hoo! Yoo-hoo! I'm back!" The doctor rose slowly to his feet. "I'm down here, Irene," he called. The cellar door opened. A young woman stood at the head of the steps. "Can you beat it?" she said. "I missed the darn train." "Oh," said the doctor. "Did you come back across the field?" "Yes, like a fool," she said. "I could have hitched a ride and caught the train up the line, only I didn't think. If you'd run me over to the junction, I could still make it." "Maybe," said the doctor. "Did you meet anyone coming back?" "Not a soul," she said. "Aren't you finished with that old job yet?" "I'm afraid I'll have to take it all up again," said the doctor. "Come down here, my dear, and I'll show you." "Doctor," said Major Sinclair, "we certainly must have you with us for Christmas." Tea was being poured, and the carpenter's living room was filled with friends who had come to say last-minute farewells to the doctor and his wife. "He shall be back," said Mrs. Carpenter, "I promise you." "It's hardly certain," said Dr. Carpenter. "I'd like nothing better, of course." "After all," said Mr. Hewitt, "you've contracted to lecture only for 3 months." "Anything may happen," said Dr. Carpenter. "Whatever happens," said Mrs. Carpenter, beaming at them, "he shall be back in England for Christmas. You may all believe me." They all believed her. The doctor himself almost believed her. For 10 years she had been promising him for dinner parties, garden parties, committees, heaven knows what, and the promises had always been kept. The farewells began. There was a fluting of compliments on dear Hermione's marvelous arrangements. She and her husband would drive to Southampton that evening. They would embark the following day. No trains, no bustle, no last-minute worries. Certainly the doctor was marvelously looked after. He would be a great success in America, especially with Hermione to see to everything. She would have a wonderful time, too. She would see the skyscrapers. Nothing like that in Little Godwearing. But she must be very sure to bring him back. Yes, I will bring him back. You may rely on it. He mustn't be persuaded. No extensions, no wonderful post at some super-American hospital. Our infirmary needs him, and he must be back by Christmas. Yes, Mrs. Carpenter called to the last departing guest. I shall see to it. He shall be back by Christmas. The final arrangements for closing the house were very well managed. The maids soon had the tea things washed up. They came in, said goodbye, and were in time to catch the afternoon bus to Devizes. Nothing remained but odds and ends, locking doors, seeing that everything was tidy. "Go upstairs," said Hermione, "and change into your brown tweeds. Empty the pockets of that suit before you put it in your bag. I'll see to everything else. All you have to do is not to get in the way." The doctor went upstairs and took off the suit he was wearing. But instead of the brown tweeds, he put on an old, dirty bath gown, which he took from the back of his wardrobe. Then, after making 1 or 2 little arrangements, he leaned over the head of the stairs and called to his wife, "Hermione, have you a moment to spare?" "Of course, dear, I'm just finished." "Just come up here for a moment. There's something rather extraordinary up here." Hermione immediately came up. "Good heavens, my dear man," she said when she saw her husband. "What are you lounging about in that filthy old thing for? I told you to have it burned long ago." "Who in the world," said the doctor, "has dropped a gold chain down the bathtub drain?" "Nobody has, of course," said Hermione. "Nobody wears such a thing." "Then what is it doing there?" said the doctor. "Take this flashlight. If you lean right over, you can see it shining, deep down." "Some Woolworth's bangle off one of the maids," said Hermione. "It can be nothing else." However, she took the flashlight and leaned over, squinting into the drain. The doctor, raising a short length of lead pipe, struck 2 or 3 times with great force and precision. and tilting the body by the knees, tumbled it into the tub. He then slipped off the bathrobe and, standing completely naked, unwrapped a towel full of implements and put them into the wash basin. He spread several sheets of newspaper on the floor and turned once more to his victim. She was dead, of course, horribly doubled up like a somersaulter at one end of the tub. He stood looking at her for a very long time, thinking of absolutely nothing at all. Then he saw how much blood there was, and his mind began to move again. First he pushed and pulled until she lay straight in the bath, and then he removed her clothing. In a narrow bathtub, this was an extremely clumsy business, but he managed it at last and then turned on the taps. The water rushed into the tub, then dwindled, then died away, and the last of it gurgled down the drain. "Good God," he said. She turned it off at the main. There was only one thing to do. The doctor hastily wiped his hands on a towel, opened the bathroom door with a clean corner of the towel, threw it back onto the bathroom stool, and ran downstairs, barefoot, light as a cat. The cellar door was in a corner of the entrance hall under the stairs. He knew just where the cutoff was. He had reason to. He had been pottering about down there in the cellar for some time past, trying to scrape out a bin for wine, he had told Hermione. He pushed open the cellar door, went down the steep steps, and just before the closing door plunged the cellar into pitch darkness, he put his hand on the tap and turned it on. Then he felt his way back along the grimy wall till he came to the steps. He was about to ascend them when the bell rang. The doctor was hardly aware of the ringing as a sound. It was like a spike of iron pushed slowly up through his stomach. It went on till it reached his brain. Then something broke. He threw himself down in the coal dust on the floor and said, "I'm through, I'm through." "They've got no right to come," he said. Then he heard himself panting. "None of this," he said to himself, "none of this." He began to revive. He got to his feet, and when the bell rang again, the sound passed through him almost painlessly. "Let them go away," he said. Then he heard the front door open. He said, "I don't care." His shoulder came up like that of a boxer to shield his face. "I give up," he said. He heard people calling, "Herbert? Hermione?" It was the Wallingfords. Damn them, they come butting in, people anxious to get off, all naked and blood and coal dust. "I'm done, I'm through, I can't do it." "Herbert? Hermione? Where the dickens can they be? The car's there. Maybe they popped round to Mrs. Liddell's. We must see them. Or to the shops, maybe, something at the last minute. Not Hermione. I say, listen, isn't that someone having a bath? Shall I shout? What about wanging on the door? Shh, don't. Might not be tactful. No harm in a shout. Look, dear, let's come in on our way back. Hermione said they wouldn't be leaving before 7. They're dining on the way in Salisbury. Think so? All right. Only I wanted a last drink with old Herbert. He'd be hurt. Let's hurry. We can be back by 6:30. The doctor heard them walk out, and the front door closed quietly behind them. He thought, 6:30. I can do it. He crossed the hall, sprang the latch of the front door, went upstairs, and taking his instruments from the wash basin, finished what he had to do. He came down again, clad in his bath gown, carrying parcel after parcel of toweling or newspaper, neatly secured with safety pins. These he packed carefully into the narrow, deep hole he had made in the corner of the cellar, shoveled in the soil, spread coal dust over all, satisfied himself that everything was in order, and went upstairs again. He then thoroughly cleansed the bath and himself and the bath again, dressed, and took his wife's clothing and his bath gown to the incinerator. 1 or 2 more little touches and everything was in order. It was only 6:15. The Wallingfords were always late. He had only to get into the car and drive off. It was a pity he couldn't wait till after dusk, but he could make a detour to avoid passing through the main street, and even if he was seen driving alone, people would only think Hermione had gone on ahead for some reason, and they would forget about it. Still, he was glad when he had finally got away, entirely unobserved, onto the open road, driving into the gathering dusk. He had to drive very carefully. He found himself unable to judge distances. His reactions were abnormally delayed, but that was a detail. When it was quite dark, he allowed himself to stop the car on the top of the downs in order to think. The stars were superb. He could see the lights of 1 or 2 little towns far away on the plain below him. He was exultant. Everything that was to follow was perfectly simple. Marion was waiting in Chicago. She already believed him to be a widower. The lecture people could be put off with a word. He had nothing to do but to establish himself in some thriving, out-of-the-way town in America, and he was safe forever. There were Hermione's clothes, of course, in the suitcases. They could be disposed of through the porthole. Thank heaven she wrote her letters on the typewriter. A little thing like handwriting might have prevented everything. But there you are, he said. She was up to date, efficient all along the line. Managed everything, managed herself to death, damn her. There's no reason to get excited, he thought. I'll write a few letters for her, then fewer and fewer. Write myself, always expecting to get back, never quite able to. Keep the house 1 year, then another, then another. They'll get used to it. Might even come back alone in a year or two and clean it up properly. Nothing easier. But not for Christmas. He started up the engine and was off. In New York, he felt free at last, really free. He was safe. He could look back with pleasure, at least after a meal, lighting his cigarette. He could look back with a sort of pleasure to the minute he had passed in the cellar, listening to the bell, the door, the voices. He could look forward to Marion. As he strolled through the lobby of his hotel, the clerk, smiling, held up letters for him. It was the first batch from England. Well, what did that matter? It would be fun, dashing off the typewritten sheets in Hermione's downright style, signing them with her squiggle, telling everyone what a success his first lecture had been, how thrilled he was with America, but how certainly she'd bring him back for Christmas. Doubts would creep in later. He glanced over the letters. Most were for Hermione. From the Sinclairs, the Wallingfords, the vicar, and a business letter from Holt & Sons, builders and decorators. He stood in the lounge, people brushing by him. He opened the letters with his thumb, reading here and there, smiling. They all seemed very confident he would be back for Christmas. They relied on Hermione. That's where they make their big mistake, said the doctor, who had taken to American phrases. The builder's letter he kept to the last, some bill probably. However, it ran, Dear Madam, we are in receipt of your kind acceptance of estimate as below, and also of key. We beg to repeat you may have every confidence in same being ready in ample time for Christmas present as stated. We are setting men to work this week. We are, madam, yours faithfully, Paul Holt & Sons. To excavating, building up, suitably lining one sunken wine bin and cellar, as indicated, using best materials, making good, etc., £18.